Hi, this is Lawrence Leckerbill. You are listening to TV Confidential.
How do you do? My presence here is to acquaint you with a series called The Twilight Zone. We think it's a rather special kind of series. Essentially, people watch television to get entertained. And the keynote of this series, the thing we're concerned with, the thing we're aiming for, the thing we're working toward is entertainment. This is a series for the storyteller, because it's our thinking that an audience will always sit still and listen and watch a well-told story. And now that I've immodestly gone on record predicting the high quality of this series, let me very briefly show you what we mean by a special kind of series.
Ed Robertson welcoming you back to TV Confidential, radio talk show about television. If you know your television history, folks, you know that calendar year 2024 and the 2024-2025 television season marked the 65th anniversary of the premiere of The Twilight Zone on CBS television, while this past December 25th marked the 100th anniversary of the birth of Rod Serling. Since its debut in 1959, Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone continues to leave an indelible mark on pop culture, captivating millions of viewers across 3 generations. It is one of the few shows that has never really left television. Somewhere, someplace, someone is not only watching The Twilight Zone as we speak, but they may very well be discovering The Twilight Zone for the very first time. Here to help us celebrate Rod Serling's centennial are Rod's daughters, Ann Serling and Jodi Serling. Ann, of course, is the author of As I Knew Him, My Dad, Rod Serling, an intimate portrait of the Emmy Award-winning creator of The Twilight Zone and Night Gallery that is also a moving testament to the love between fathers and daughters. Ann has been on our program a couple times before. While this is Jodi's first visit to TV Confidential, Ann and Jodi, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Also with us today is award-winning science fiction screenwriter, producer, and novelist Marc Scott Zicree. Marc's credits in film and television include scripts for such classic series as Star Trek: The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Babylon 5, Beauty and the Beast, and many other animated series, not to mention the 1986 version of The Twilight Zone. Marc also wrote, produced, directed, and co-created the epic sci-fi series Space Command. He is also the author of the groundbreaking, influential, and still very, very popular television reference book, The Twilight Zone Companion, recently revised as a 3rd edition, and a book that has not only influenced such TV showrunners and filmmakers as J.J. Abrams, Vince Gilligan, Brannon Braga, and Ron Moore, but created the genre of TV biographies, books that capture the history of popular television series. Marc Scott Zicree, welcome to our program as well.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you. Ann, this is for Ann and Jodi, but I've said this to Ann before. I'll say it to you both again. For many of us, Rod Serling is an icon. Rod Serling is a mythic figure. And Ann's book particularly gives us a sense of who he was as a human being, and without taking away any of the mythic figure stuff. But it reminds that he was a man of contradictions, like everybody else, and he was very much a loving father, like everybody else.
Yeah, he was nothing like the image that people saw on television. He was silly, he was funny, he loved the Flintstones, he did the best gorilla impersonation you could imagine, as is evidenced in almost every home movie. He did have a bad temper, but it was very short-lived. And for instance, he'd get very angry and then he'd walk out of the room and return about 5 minutes later and say, "Have you seen my twin brother anywhere?" He was just, I never went through the phase where, a lot of teenagers go through where you don't want to be around your parents. I loved being around my dad, and my friends did too. He was fun. He was, and always interested in what my friends were doing. He'd ask what their parents did, what they wanted to do, and he practiced what he preached. He was a terrific human being and a great dad, and I never forget that. It's still a tremendous loss every day, actually.
When Ann and Jodi, when did you first realize that your dad was a little more well known than the other dads at school? Jodi first, and Ann.
Growing up with my dad, we weren't affected by the limelight of Hollywood. My dad definitely protected us from it. He wanted us to be our own self and to, go through life with our own things that were important to us. I did go to school with some kids that had famous fathers, but it wasn't like a big deal. I mean, he kept us grounded and told us to search for our own, whatever turned us on. He never tried to encourage us into the Hollywood scene, and just wanted us to be ourselves and be strong that way, I think.
And I would just piggyback on that. The paparazzi back then was not what it is today. It wasn't as invasive and insane, thank God. But the only, this is something I just thought about very, very recently. I mean, today, it's not unusual to go to school. Today it's not unusual to go to school down here in the LA area and have people and have friends whose mom or dad work in film or work in television. Whereas, because the medium was was still very much in its early stages, its first decade or so, when you were growing up, it was a little different to have a dad who worked in television versus a dad who was a plumber or a dad who was a lawyer or something like that. And the fact that he was a writer, which is sort of an anonymous job, but he was the face of the Twilight Zone, so he was very visual. So that made him a little more well known in that way.
Things are very exciting. Hello, you're back. You froze for a moment.
Yes.
There you are. We're
doing this via Zoom, folks. So we're working through the kinks that are part of the pluses and minuses of modern day technology. But
yes, the wonderful modern age.
Stay with us, folks. We'll be right back. One more item. If you're starting a company, particularly one that is in an emerging market, you know that averting any sort of legal dispute is crucial to your business plan. Our friends at Tectonic Law offer an array of services that can help you avoid and preempt future litigation while also developing and protecting your intellectual property and intangible assets. Tectonic Law serves the needs of a host of emerging industries throughout California and beyond, including industrial designers, beverage makers, artists, farmers, retail stores, health practitioners, wellness experts, cosmetics manufacturers, nonprofit organizations, innovators in sustainable practices, and libraries. Go to tectoniclaw.com to learn more about how Tectonic Law can help your business thrive. tectoniclaw.com. Rock solid representation for groundbreaking industries.
This portion of TV Confidential is brought to us by our friends at Front Porch Realty, the community of realtors in the Northern Bay Area of California that is committed to finding the solution that is best for their clients. Whether you're a first-time home buyer or looking to sell or lease your property in Northern California, call Karen Strain at 415-886-7411 or visit frontporchrealtygroup.com for more information on how they can help you.
Hi, this is writer-director Joseph Doherty, and you're listening to the award-seeking show TV Confidential.
This is sand. It represents desert. The desert that you'll see on your screen in a story we call The Lonely. The Lonely is about a man sentenced to a lifetime of solitary confinement. The confinement takes place on a sandy asteroid far out in space. It's the story about a man slowly succumbing to a kind of nightmarish loneliness.
We're with Ann Serling and Jodi Serling, the daughters of Rod Serling. Ann Serling, author of As I Knew Him, My Dad, Rod Serling, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the birth of Rod Serling, along with Marc Scott Zicree. Marc Scott Zicree, author of the Twilight Zone Companion, both As I Knew Him, My Dad, Rod Serling, and The Twilight Zone Companion, available wherever books are sold, as well as Amazon.com. Mark?
Well, the thing I'll jump in here. One thing I love about Rod and about hearing both Anne and Jodi talk about growing up with him is that the Hollywood cliche is of the person who is so dazzled by being a star, by being famous, that they lose all perspective. They become Hollywood, creeps, and they're terrible parents. It's like no more wire hangers, all that stuff. But Rod was the exact opposite. He had his feet on the ground and he loved being. I mean, it was great to succeed, obviously, to have your writing out there and be a public figure, but he kept. It's wonderful to me that he had time for his family, that he had time for his daughters, that there was never the feeling of, oh, we're a footnote to his life. Correct? Would you agree with me?
Oh, yeah.
When I was writing my book, I read an article that said he worked 12 hours a day, and yet I never had that sense that he wasn't available. In fact, when I'd come home from school, we'd play basketball together.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was such a loving guy. I mean, the thing that I love about Rod is that he had such passion for everything. It's like he had passion for the work, passion for the life, passion for you guys. I mean, it was, it's wonderful. You wonder how he was able to cram all of that into 50 short years, but gosh, I'm very gratified to hear how loving he was. And Jodi,
Well,
yeah, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, and my sister would agree, is that, that he was very grounded. I think at the beginning of his career, he was very shy, but I will say that my mother kept him grounded, and she was his rock of Gibraltar. And if he did seem like he was straying a little bit or getting too involved in the scene, she kept him grounded. I mean, she was his main person for sure.
Yeah,
definitely.
Jodi just mentioned Rod's wife, Carol Serling. I understand for you, Mark, that was part of your entree into the world of Rod Serling.
Yes, I would be probably living in the gutter with no career or life without Carol Serling. It was amazing. It was wonderful. When I got out of college, I knew I wanted to be a writer, producer in TV, but there were no classes in that. There was no way to learn it. There were no books on that. And so I thought, well, by studying one of the greatest, if not the greatest TV shows ever made, maybe I can learn how to do this. Plus, of course, I loved The Twilight Zone. I loved Rod Serling. And this was only 2 years after Rod's death. So we're talking 1977. He died in 75. And I knew if I went directly to Carol with this proposal of writing a book about the Twilight Zone, she would say no, because she had already turned down major journalists. And I had one short story sale and an art degree. So I knew there would be a quick no. But when I was 16, I'd met one of the writers from the Twilight Zone, George Clayton Johnson, who was a phenomenal writer. He wrote Kick the Can and Nothing in the Dark, and also the first episode of Star Trek ever aired, The Man Trap. And when I told him I had an idea, I wanted to pursue this, he was able to introduce me to other people who had worked on Twilight Zone, who then introduced me to other people. So over a 3-month period, I interviewed 30 people who'd worked on the show before I went to Carol. And if Carol had said no, it would have been no, and I would have put in that time and effort, but it was worth it because there's a dog that goes crazy when they take it out for a walk. Sorry about that. Sorry about the noise.
That's okay. We've had many animal friends make cameo appearances in our program.
Yes. So, so after those 30 interviews, I set up a meeting with Carol, and it was at the house in Pacific Palisades, and she was wonderful. I remember being in that living room. Everything was exactly as Rod had left it. There was the room full of trophies, the 6 Emmys and the Peabody Awards and all of that. And I stood telling Carol what I had in mind and in terms of the book, and I felt very certain I could do it. I really felt assured that I knew how to do it. And she said, well, let me talk to some people and get back to you. And clearly she talked to people like Beck Houghton, who had produced The Twilight Zone, and Richard Matheson, some of the people that she trusted. And she came back and said, you've got full access to everything. And that was miraculous. And so I ultimately ended up interviewing over 100 people who'd worked on the show. And this is back when they were still with us. I mean, now most are gone. It's funny because I'm shooting a new TV show with Billy Mumy and Veronica Cartwright, who starred in episodes of The Twilight Zone. So they still are a lifeline to that history. But But yeah, and so I spent 5 years from when I started the book to when it came out was 5 years, and it hasn't been out of print since. And I was literally crawling through Rod Serling's attic because up in the attic in that house there were these huge scrapbooks. Rod subscribed to a clipping service, and so every article ever written about Rod or the Twilight Zone, it was a chronological history right there in those volumes. And his files were up there. I found a book filled with scripts that were written for Twilight Zone but never made. Amazing, amazing stuff. And Jodi and Anne both were so welcoming and so kind to me. I interviewed both of them, of course, and I still have the photos I took of you guys back in '78, and it was like literally it was like going through the looking glass. It was magical. And I have enormous gratitude because I started writing that book when I was 21, and by the time I was 22 or 23, I was actually writing for television as well. And so thank you all.
And
well, I have to tell you, Marc, I'm sorry.
okay.
I've told Marc this before, that his book is probably one of the most informative, down-to-earth books of the Twilight Zone ever written.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty incredible. I mean, he doesn't miss anything in that book.
What's surprising too is that he was 21, 22 years old, and to have the wherewithal to be able to navigate through that is pretty
Yeah.
stunning.
And there weren't books on other TV shows really to use as guidelines,
Exactly. If I may, I've written 7 TV biographies myself over the years. You and I have a mutual friend. We all have a mutual friend in Mark DeWidziak.
Oh yeah.
Yes. And when I first met Mark for the first time, I said to him, your Columbo file book was that was the model on which I based my book on The Fugitive and later Rockford Files. And Mark, being a very gracious fellow, said, truth be told, I based the Columbo file on Marc Scott Zicree's The Twilight Zone Companion. That is the Bible.
Yes.
So
yeah.
I would not have, my books were not for you, Marc, and there would not be this whole library, this genre of books on television were it not.
Well, thanks. Your book. And it was very interesting. Oh, go ahead.
It was tremendously helpful as I wrote mine too, as I've told you, Marc.
Thanks. Thank you. Well, one of the things, it was fascinating because I wrote the book because I really wanted to understand how these amazing stories came into existence, how these amazing men were able to write these stories, imagine these stories, Rod and Matheson and Beaumont and George Clayton Johnson and Earl Hamner. And so when I was writing the manuscript, Bantam, my publisher, said, well, we want you to cut out all the material on the writers. Nobody cares about the writers. And I said, that's my reason for writing the book, so I'll work a trade with you. You can use whatever photos you want. I had hundreds of photos from the Twilight Zone. I said, you can select the photos. I won't have any say over that, but I need to keep this material in because that's why I'm writing the book. And fortunately, I won that battle. And because I wasn't doing a puff piece, I wasn't doing some fan, trivial thing. You see a lot of those books that are very once over, on various TV shows. But I really wanted to get to the meat of it and the heart of it. And of course, that started with the writers. And Rod, of course, was, more than anything, he was a writer, and everything else was in service, being the executive producer, all of those things, being on-screen talent, that all served his objectives as a writer.
Marc Scott Zicree is with us via Zoom, as are Jodi Serling and Anne Serling, the daughters of Rod Serling. Anne Serling, author of As I Knew Him, My Dad, Rod Serling, Marc Scott Zicree, author of The Twilight Zone Companion. The 2024-2025 television season marks the 65th anniversary of the premiere of The Twilight Zone on CBS, while this past December 25th was the 100th anniversary of the birth of Rod Serling. We'll take a quick time out. We'll continue our conversation with Jodi, Anne, and Marc. We come back on TV Confidential.